happy occasion, actually, and I actually mean that. We're welcoming back, what? We're welcoming back our very good colleague and an often friend, Brendan Schechter, who was the Elihu Rose military history scholar at NYU for some years. And now he's still living in the New York area, teaching in different places, although he will be back here in the spring to teach again, which would be very nice. And for the time he was here, he's a wonderful colleague, really. And always a good presence, not only at the events, but in the classrooms and the meetings. And we kind of miss you, but you're still kind of here. And although he's a Berkeley graduate, he's not only forgiven, but we've adopted him. He's always welcome back. And he's here to present now a book that just came out recently, which I can tell you is a good book, that is worth reading. Again, I'm being serious about this. And the title of the book is The Stuff of Soldiers, A History of the Red Army in World War II Through Objects. So, giving new meaning to objective history. Finally, we have someone who writes objective history. He's going to talk to us about the book itself and lay out the basic arguments. I can tell you that it's an original approach to war, and in particular to anything I've read about Russian armies and Soviet armies, which is to say it uses material culture to enter into a larger subject. And the rest I'll leave to Brendan himself.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
For that warm and unambiguous introduction, Yanni. I have copies of the table of contents just in case you want to interrogate me about things I don't get to. And can you pass that copy of the book around just so that it is, so people can leaf through it. Yeah. So it is absolutely wonderful to be back here, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the crowd today. People I went to grad school with, people who mentored me in grad school, people who mentored me here, colleagues here. Absolutely fantastic. And what I'm going to do today is, rather than try to give an overview of the book as a whole, I will be cherry-picking objects from different sections of the book and kind of showing you what I do with them, and presenting a narrative that is one of the narratives in the book through these objects. In The Stuff of Soldiers, I try to tell the story of the Great Patriotic War, the largest war in world history, a war in which 34.5 million people are mobilized into the Red Army. That is all classes of Soviet people, men, women, convicts, Komsomol members, peasants who had recently been expropriated in the previous decade, just all walks of life. Virtually all ethnic groups of the Soviet Union are represented in this force. And I try to tell this epic event through objects, and through objects from, as we'll see today, some of the most humble objects to some of the most significant objects. And today's all going to be humble objects, actually. I treat objects as both instruments, as things that allow people to do things, and as carriers of meaning. And rather than walk through all the different things that I try to do with objects, I'll leave that for you to interrogate me about during question and answer, and I'm going to get right into the narrative that I want to talk about today. So, as I said, I will be presenting parts of 3 different chapters. And the book itself is divided into 3 different sections, and these objects are drawn from each of these sections. The first section of the book is about the body, bodily practices, and is called Mortal Envelopes. The second part of the book is about violence, as a chapter that is basically about not getting killed, and a chapter that is about killing. And the third section of the book is possessions, which is basically about what soldiers carry with them and what soldiers loot at the end of the war. So one of the chapters I'll be drawing from today is a chapter about food. This is particularly about the political economy of rationing and the social importance of eating in the Red Army, and we'll get to that in a moment. Another peers into the soldier's knapsack, and that chapter has a prolonged discussion about the knapsack itself, the amount of stuff that soldiers carry around, how there's very little room to carry anything in a soldier's knapsack, and that's something we'll be talking about at length in just a few minutes, so I'm not going to go into more detail about that here. And then the final chapter that I will be drawing from today is a chapter about trenches. It's a chapter about basically how soldiers try to survive on the modern battlefield, and I'll be presenting most of the important stuff from that chapter today, so I'm not going to dwell on it here. What I really want to talk about today is how soldiers in the Red Army, who have this often very nomadic existence where they're traveling over great distances separated from their families, how these soldiers in these nomadic situations maintain a sense of self through various objects, and also how these soldiers basically settle certain places with this variety of objects. So there's a cycle basically for Red Army soldiers where they're nomadic at some points and sedentary at other points. Something I'll get into a lot more detail out in a little while. But I want you to keep that in mind, that this is the framework of it, creating meaning through objects in these various settings. So, as I've mentioned, soldiers are often covering vast different distances. They have to carry everything that they need with them. They're traveling on foot most of the time. They usually have about 24 kilograms of gear or more. Most of the space in their knapsacks and in their pockets is taken up by government issue items such as rations, changed clothing, weapons, stuff to maintain their weapons, ammunition. So that means that absolutely anything that they're carrying with them that's extra weight has to be either very, very useful or has to have a tremendous emotional weight. So soldiers are bringing a variety of things from them from home. These include knives, combs, dishes, and they talk about these in their letters, actually quite a bit. And very often you'll run into a soldier who basically will be writing a letter to his wife or mistress in some cases, saying basically, you know, you wanted me to take that knife, I didn't want to take it. You wanted me to take that comb, I didn't want to take it. I'm so glad that I did. It's so useful. Now every time when I use it, I think of you, and I promise to bring it home. The soldier is promising to survive the war. This object becomes, this very banal object becomes invested with tremendous emotional weight. Another object that was very common for soldiers and that often started off as a more or less anonymous object that became invested with tremendous emotional weight are cassietti, or tobacco pouches. It was common for school children, as we see here, to basically embroider tobacco pouches and send them anonymously to soldiers at the front. Soldiers write about their tobacco pouches. Some soldiers who get these anonymous tobacco pouches become obsessed with finding out who is the person who made this for me, and it becomes a deeply personal thing. Twardowski in Vasily Tyorkin, probably the most popular poem of the war and probably the most popular fictitious character of the war, he devotes an entire poem to mourning the loss of this guy's tobacco pouch who he loses on the field of battle. And smoking together is an incredibly important social moment in the Red Army. One thing that we'll come back to again and again today are moments of bringing people together in the Red Army. Because one of the red threads of the book is how this military experience brings together, and then in other cases, tears apart groups of people. One of the objects that was it was the very first object I decided to write about, and is an counterintuitive object for how important something can be in war, is spoons. If you read the book, you'll see that I frame the introduction around a spoon, and I devote a chapter to the spoon and rations. And the reason for this is that the only sanctioned piece of personal property that a Red Army soldier has is their spoon. And one character who I followed throughout the book wrote in his diary in the spring of 1942, quote, "Without a spoon, just as without a rifle, it is impossible to wage war." Lev Slyozkin, early in his military service, described how soldiers at a cafeteria were totally confounded by the sight of anything other than spoons. That they, quote, "like troglodytes, looked with tender emotion at knives and forks. In the barracks, we eat only with spoons." And finally, Gabriel Temkin, in his memoirs, remembered that, quote, "Frontline soldiers would sometimes, in panicky retreats, throw away their heavy rifles, but never their spoons." In the Red Army, everything that soldiers are given to eat can be eaten either with their bare hands or with spoons. Having a spoon is the mark of a real soldier. A real soldier has a spoon. That means that they're responsible. That means that a frontline soldier has a spoon. People without spoons are treated as unreliable or people of an entirely different class. It's noted that when generals come to the front, they don't have their own spoons because they're used to being served. And this is a big mark, this becomes a big mark of class. Soldiers become very invested in their spoons, occasionally writing incantations such as "Ishi miasa suka" on this spoon, "where's the meat, bitch," essentially, an incantation that hopes to find large chunks of meat in the soup or porridge that the soldier is dipping a spoon into. And will often write their names. We see there's a little heart that's been carved into this other spoon, and personalize these objects. The Army is constantly putting in orders, basically on a quarterly level. There's orders for millions of spoons that are coming in when you look at requisition orders. And they're occasionally taking soldiers off the front line to carve wooden spoons for soldiers, because without a spoon, just as without a rifle, you cannot wage war. This is somewhat ironic if you know the history of the spoon, particularly the wooden spoon in Russian culture, and the process of collective eating that the Red Army is partaking in. Spoons, particularly wooden spoons, had been associated with a variety of infections, in particular syphilis, in the Tsarist period and early Soviet period. And getting people to move away from collective eating was a major part of the early Soviet project. People were supposed to eat in collective spaces, but they were supposed to eat from their own bowl. And this idea of potential pollution from people sharing cutlery, sharing silverware, is a big issue. In the Red Army, eating together is supposed to be a moment that brings people together. There's a certain kind of cadence to this. So food would often be brought up right before dawn and right after dusk, because this is a particularly vulnerable time for soldiers, and oftentimes the people bringing up food or preparing the food are among the first casualties in a regiment. And basically, the ideal Soviet meal in the Red Army is soup, porridge, and tea. Soldiers are given one pot in theory. Oftentimes they have to share pots. So what this often means is that soldiers are sharing pots, and this bringing people together around eating is really important to the Red Army in particular, because it is an army that is very much in flux. Soldiers are often moving in and out of units very quickly. Units are often thrown together very quickly. So anything you can do to bring people together more quickly is very important. Now, ironically, food can also, well, actually, before I get to the ironic part, let me also mention one other interesting thing here is that the culinary culture of the Soviet Union changes during the war in that large groups of people are introduced to new food. Many Russians eat pilav for the first time. Many Uzbeks eat borscht for the first time. And food historian William Pochlopkin, who was himself a veteran, claims that basically nobody east of the Urals had eaten a potato before the war, and they're eating tons of potatoes during the war. But this can also tear people apart. For one thing, the primary protein in the Red Army is pork, and there are large numbers of Muslims being mobilized as well as large numbers of Jews. Beyond that, the hierarchies of food separated soldiers from their families. Soldiers knew that they were eating much better than their families were, and also they knew that their commanders were eating much better than they were. And this becomes a bone of contention at various points in the war. Spoons also are important in marking time, and eating together is important in marking time, because, and this comes up in memoirs and autobiographical fiction and also occasionally in diaries, eating is when people realize that who's alive and who's dead, when they gather around and see who's missing. This is captured very eloquently in Grigory Baklano's autobiographical novel, Forever 19. Quote, "Only after he swallowed did he look at what he was eating. In his mess pot was thick yellow pea soup, and with this spoon, with his eyes closed, he mentally held a funerary feast for those who today were no longer with them. They were still here, all the same. They could stumble into the kitchen at any moment, sit in the sun," end quote. And, interestingly enough, spoons are often one of the few vectors by which the remains of Red Army soldiers that are disinterred today can be identified, because soldiers would often write their names or initials into their spoons. The only other major vector, because the Red Army, basically the main forms of identification of the Red Army are all paper-based, which means they disintegrate with bodies. The only other vector for identifying soldiers are if there are serial numbers on their medals that can be traced back. So, this is a vital object in terms of life, and ends up being a vital object potentially after death. Now, in addition to calories, soldiers need to feed their connections to their pre-war lives and their families, and this brings me to the second object that I'm going to be talking about today, which is letters. Red Army soldiers, like soldiers in many armies, were obsessed with getting mail, and they described letters as, quote, "a piece of peaceful life," or, quote, "our only comfort and tiny bridge connecting us to another life." The political apparatus of the Red Army was equally invested in making sure that soldiers got mail. And in June of 1942, the commissar of the 11th Guards Rifle Division, Andrei Orlov, reflected on how key letters were to soldiers' morale and why political work should center on correspondences. Quote, "Here people are experienced, battered, but when they get a letter from home, some valve starts to work better in their body. If a soldier can't write, the politruk, the political instructor, should come and help him write. Connect him with his family. If the family isn't well appointed, then the regimental, divisional, or corps commander needs to help out in any way possible." End quote. So as we see from these quotes, letters are central to both soldiers' concerns and the concerns of the political apparatus of the Red Army. Mail will allow soldiers uprooted from their families and communities to maintain a sense of self while waging war, to learn about what's going on with their closest connections. And soldiers would write and eagerly await letters, while the Soviet government inserted itself into these ostensibly deeply personal correspondences at multiple levels. From commanders who read their subordinates' letters, to a massive censorship apparatus that was supposed to read every single letter sent to and from the front. So I'm going to talk a little bit about infrastructure. Mail to and from the army was free. And given the dramatic paper shortage in the Soviet Union, basically from the beginning until the end of Stalin's time, there's a wide variety of paper that's used, and they come up with this special triangular way of folding paper so that they don't need envelopes. This also makes it easier to censor them because you don't have to open an envelope, you just have to open the letter. And we see here, these could be made of these letters could be written on virtually anything, pages torn from books, newspapers, ration cartons, any sort of thing. Getting mail in the Red Army could be quite difficult. A soldier's address was tied to their unit, so if they were wounded or transferred, they would have no address. And soldiers actually mention this in correspondence. Somebody who's in the hospital waiting to be transferred somewhere might write, "Do not write me until I give you a new address," because the letter's just going to be lost. Units that were in remote regions, far in advance of the front line, or encircled by the enemy, had no way of getting mail. And some soldiers complain about, it's a couple of people I follow, they get their first letter 5 or 6 months into their service. And this is deeply depressing for them. Sending mail and actually writing a letter required significant effort. You needed time, you needed to find paper, and you needed to know the addresses of the people who you were writing to. And remember, millions of people throughout the Soviet Union are being evacuated from cities in the West deep into the hinterland. Friends are being mobilized into the army. So trying to find out where people are to write to is a major part of these letters. Now, excuse me. Of course, the state is trying to control what soldiers read and write. They're trying to control soldiers' moods to a certain extent through letters. And as I mentioned, all these letters pass through this massive system of censorship. And they're basically looking for two things when they censor a letter. They're looking for the betrayal of military secrets, which they view generally as something pretty innocent that just needs to be crossed out. And they're looking for anti-Soviet attitudes, which can lead to the prosecution of the person who has written the letter. So if someone is complaining too vigorously about some aspect of how the war is being conducted, this is something that can and occasionally does lead to prosecution. They're also reading these letters to get an understanding of what soldiers' moods are and to get an understanding of what major issues the army is facing. Censorship aims to frame conversations as well. They're shielding soldiers from certain types of bad news, such as family members who have been arrested or are in deep poverty, and while also promoting certain types of bad news that might motivate soldiers. So initially in 1943, as they're liberating large sections of the Soviet Union, and all sorts of villages are being liberated, they're censoring any sort of description of the terrible things the Germans have done during occupation. And then they sit down and they realize, no, this is really good. This will motivate people to keep fighting. We need information about all the terrible things the Germans have done. This will keep people fighting. However, anonymous denunciations of family members of Red Army soldiers are to be censored. But credible denunciations of family members who collaborated with the Germans are not to be censored. So they're negotiating this during the war as well. Soldiers seem quite aware of the fact that they're being monitored. A random sample of 55,000 letters over 2 days in July of 1943 mention only 51 complaints. So, these are Soviet people who are used to functioning in a system where most of what they're saying is liable to be used against them at some point, or can be used against them at some point. So they're quite comfortable with this system and know this. Civilians seem much less aware of what they can and cannot write about. Excuse me. So letters are viewed to be of absolutely key political importance. They're supposed to serve as major food for political discussions within the Red Army. Red Army meetings are often centered around letters from home. They make up a major portion of Red Army press, is the reprinting of letters to and from the front. Everyone understands that they're absolutely key for morale, and commanders are often reading soldiers' letters unsolicited before they're delivered to them, and sometimes their comrades are as well. And Commanders are also very often writing unsolicited letters home, shaming or praising soldiers, and they're really injecting themselves into their soldiers' personal lives in this very, very key way. They're also making sure that, and this is an interesting thing that happens, they set up this apparatus where while they're censoring any information about poverty of family members, they set up a thing where the commander is then warned that, okay, Private Ivanov's mother needs a cow. You now need to fill out the paperwork so that Private Ivanov's mother gets the cow, but you never mention this to Private Ivanov. So they set up this system where they're supposed to fix these problems while still not letting soldiers know about them. Political workers are supposed to organize pen pals for the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of soldiers whose families are on occupied territory. And so there are some soldiers who get thousands of letters. I've even come across at least one case of catfishing in the Red Army. Catfishing, so basically what this is this guy starts a correspondence with this woman, and you can send parts of your pay home, and she convinces him, having never met him, that she should start getting parts of his pay, because they'll probably have a romantic relationship after.
And that's called catfishing?
In modern parlance, on the online, catfishing is, yeah. There's also this genre known as the nakaz, which are these collective letters where a military unit might get together, and we see this is what's going on right here, and write back to their kolkhoz or their factory, or a military unit that gets a tank or an artillery piece might write back to the factory that made that thing, where they exchange vows to talk about how they will defeat the enemy more quickly, how they know and appreciate what people in the rear are doing for them, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the practices associated with these letters. Most Red Army letters seem to have been read aloud to an audience of people. This was very popular with soldiers because there's not that much else to do. This is a form of entertainment. And this is also official practice. So in many of these letters, you'll see that they function more like a newsletter than an intimate correspondence, and there's usually an explicit statement of, don't tell mom about this, don't let other people see this. And Pyotr Vesolov wrote his wife in July of 1942, quote, "The guys brought me your letter. In the trench, we always read your letters together in the squad, because in our correspondence, there is no lack of self-control," end quote. Whether this was him praising her for knowing how to write a proper letter or a warning not to write anything saucy is completely impossible to tell from this letter, but it still points out to how this particular genre. Some soldiers describe a sense of guilt when they get letters and their comrades don't. And I again want to point out that this is part of these Red Army units that are often thrown together relatively quickly, and then in which people are coming in and out of very quickly. In many cases, this is a part of bringing these people together as quickly as possible, getting them intimately invested in each other as quickly as possible. This also has the bonus effect that sometimes soldiers will have read letters like a Dear John letter or letters with bad news, and will keep those letters from their friends if they're about to go out on a mission or something like that. So there is a kind of censorship within the community of friends. I'm going to talk a little bit about the contents of these letters as well. They are often incredibly repetitive because soldiers are not sure, and family members are not sure, if their letters are going to get through, or if they're going to get through in the order that they wrote them. Some soldiers talk about getting letters completely out of order, like getting a letter months later, but getting several letters from the same person in between. One of the main purposes of these letters is to serve as proof of life, is to serve as proof that at least at the time of writing, this person was alive. One of the striking things about these letters is the use of official language. Many of them repeat Stalinist stamps and repeat various forms of Soviet propaganda, which we could view as being, part of a totalitarian state, but which people who have written about World War I soldiers in France and Italy have mentioned that they do the same thing, and this seems to be largely about the fact that these are people who are relatively new to literacy. This is the first generation of mass literacy in the Soviet Union. So part of it is just discomfort with the written word. One of the most striking things I've read is a correspondence between two non-Russian soldiers where they're writing in Russian. And this was very common. It was very common to switch to Russian because in order to get a letter through in a language other than Russian, you had to find somewhere near Leningrad somebody who spoke Uzbek or Georgian or whatever. So many people switch over to Russian. And in this correspondence, this guy basically, it's a mix of profanity because he doesn't know the proper Russian words for lots of things. And this is the language of the army, right? It's profanity and Stalinist stamps. And this letter reflects that absolutely. Things that you would write about would be your accomplishments, medals that you've gotten, whether you joined the party, promotions, although you were not allowed to write about rank. Initially, you're not allowed to write about where you are geographically, but eventually they decide that family members would like to know that their family members are involved in major operations that are shaping the course of history. And I argue that what these letters are really all about are keeping bonds with family while separated. And this is, again, not unique to the Soviet Union. This is essentially what happens whenever families are separated. So a lot of the content is asking about the health and welfare of family members, looking for friends and family who have either been evacuated or have been mobilized in the army. So like if your best friend got mobilized, he's probably not going to get mobilized in your unit, so you might write his mom to find out where he is so that you can get in contact with him. Marking time since the last letter is very common. Fighting over pauses is very common, and fears of infidelity are very, very common when there's a long pause in correspondence. Discussion of the progress in school and physical growth of children. There's at least one account I know of where the wife sends the husband a string that shows how tall their son has gotten in his absence, and at least one case I know of where a wife just makes up a child to basically keep the morale high of her husband. These are men and women are trying to fulfill their roles, whether it's father, older brother, older sister, wife, husband, whatever, from afar. And in these letters, there's a sense that they can't communicate what they're experiencing, and sometimes resentment that inserts itself as people on the home front complain about, usually objectively, quite terrible material conditions, and people at the front say, well, at least you're not getting shot at. So, let me regather here. So this is I want to emphasize again, this is basically it in terms of communication with your family. In the Red Army, there's no regular system of leave. Leave is a very rare thing. So this is what you have until the war ends in terms of keeping connections. Now I've talked about the nomadic aspects of all this, and now I want to talk about some of the more sedentary aspects. Remember, this is set up of how these soldiers in this nomadic lifestyle create a sense of meaning, but there are areas that they settle, and there are ways that they settle. And one of the reasons that they have to settle is the nature of the modern battlefield, because one of the things that they're doing is wandering through this totally destroyed landscape of the war, particularly in 1943 and 44, as they're retaking large portions of the Soviet Union and going into Eastern Europe. As we see here, a destroyed village in 1943. We see here the main drag of Kiev, also in 1943. And soldiers are moving through a landscape that is both marked by war and has been turned completely to the purposes of war. All landscapes are incredibly deadly places. Soldiers are taught to read the landscape as a series of orienteers to create maximum damage for the enemy, and to use the landscape to the maximum advantage so that they themselves are not destroyed. Anything that is in the open is dead. Anything that is visible is dead. So the only way for soldiers on this modern battlefield to survive is through a tremendous amount of labor, which brings us to our third object, the spade. Soldiers have these small 50-centimeter spades that they're issued, and anytime they stop anywhere, they're supposed to start digging, because otherwise they are dead. And this will eventually lead to a more sedentary lifestyle, which I'll go into more detail in just a moment. But essentially, as a Red Army soldier, you stop anywhere. You immediately begin digging, and Red Army soldiers are actually taught to dig under fire. You immediately make a claim to this space as a space that you now control. Within 1 hour, a Red Army soldier was supposed to dig a hole that they could stand in. And it was supposed to be camouflaged, because anything that can be seen can be destroyed. They're supposed to do this in absolutely any landscape. Open steppe, swamps, cities, mountains, doesn't matter. This is their job. And these eventually evolve into a more and more sophisticated series of trenches that eventually, I argue, turn into cities of earth. Because what happens is that as they dig more and more stuff, as they settle in areas for longer and longer periods of time, and there are certain fronts where there's very little movement for months or even years at a time, they begin to move beyond trying to survive simply the elements. Remember, they're also they're living out in the open, so any shelter that they have to construct themselves. They move beyond trying to survive enemy fire in the elements to recreating various aspects of regular life. And what's fascinating here is the extent to which Soviet trenches come to resemble monoproductive cities of the first 5-year plan. They have their space of production directly at the front. The production here is killing the enemy. They have their space of rest that is separated by a green belt of camouflaged area where soldiers are supposed to rest. And what is quite unique, I think, to the Red Army is that these spaces are supposed to have all sorts of infrastructure. They're supposed to have bathhouses. They're supposed to have clubs. They're supposed to have libraries. And when the army stops for a prolonged period of time, they do actually have these things. They do actually put all this effort in. Now, the soldiers are building this themselves. But what I think is fascinating here is the extent to which the civilizing process that the city is supposed to take in regular Soviet life, trenches take in the extreme period of the war. This is a series of do-it-yourself projects. Soldiers are constructing whatever they can based on whatever things that they can scrounge around. So they're using oil cans to make stoves. There's a big problem for a prolonged period. A lot of soldiers are using telephone cable as lamps, and there's a problem with people dying of smoke inhalation. So the army says, you should just take artillery shells and you make little kerosene lamps. You cut off part of your overcoat, that becomes the wick. And there's just all variety of things that soldiers are making in these spaces. Now, what is particularly interesting in the Red Army is that demographically, because of the extreme situation the Red Army finds itself in, it is rebuilt 5 times in the course of the war. If you look at the strength of the Red Army in 1941 and how many people passed through it by the end of the war, it's a 488% loss, so rebuilt 5 times. This means that they're drafting everybody. The draft age is 17 to 55. There's women. There's all different types of people. This means that demographically, this represents Soviet society much more closely than, say, the American Army does, which is, the American Army is almost exclusively 18 to 35-year-old men, right? As opposed to the Red Army is a much wider swath of people. And the state becomes really quite interested in these spaces and making sure that things are up to code. Starting in 1943, they're sending delegations to the front all the time to just make sure that, do the bunkers have windows? Are the bunkers warm enough? Are they well lit enough? Are soldiers getting enough food? And within this space, this is also where the state tries to influence soldiers. This is also where political workers are making the rounds and trying to explain the goals of the war to soldiers. This is a space where often very poorly trained soldiers who have just been sent to the front are learning the skills to survive from veteran soldiers who have survived some period at the front. This is also a space of intermingling of all different types of Soviet people. People talk about, in this space, finding out all sorts of things about, for example, urban people find out about collectivization from people who have undergone collectivization for the first time. It's very popular for peasants to tell various types of fairy tales. There's all these very strange ideas about biology, such as, if you miss home too much, then you'll definitely get lice. This is like a common thing in the military, and it's a peasant thing. So both in terms of what the state is trying to do and in terms of what's going on from below, this is a very important space of socialization. Some soldiers imagine themselves far from the front, engaged in the types of things they'd be doing in civilian life. Some of them imagine in their bunkers that they're in a cafe somewhere in Moscow, and having very much the same conversations about romance, about poetry, about whatever, while drinking tea and sharing cigarettes and dipping their own individual spoons into their shared pots. So this is a space of total mixing, and this is also, it's interesting to talk about the fact that this is a space of mixing of men and women. So there are many romantic pairings that come out of this, and this is also a space where many women find themselves having to constantly escape what we would now call sexual harassment in these spaces, because this is a totally mixed space. So I'm really much more interested in what you have to say in terms of interrogating me than for talking for a prolonged period of time today. So I'm going to kind of wrap things up and remind everyone to look at the table of contents, look at the book. Anything that I didn't talk about today, I would love to talk about in question and answer. And just remind everyone that letters allowed soldiers to insert themselves in the everyday lives of their loved ones and maintain a web of connections with friends and family that made life meaningful under conditions in which death was a very likely outcome. As one Lieutenant Akhtiamov, who did not survive the war, wrote his family several times, quote, "In spirit, I am still in the village with you." Unquote. All of the diversity of the country came together in these bunkers, and the need to while away the sometimes interminable hours between battle and training and constant digging, there was little else to do but talk, read, and write, all things that were done collectively. In short, this was a significant space not only for waging war, but for the entire Soviet people to come together and learn about each other. It's very difficult to imagine another situation in which an Uzbek and a Ukrainian would become best friends, where somebody from Tbilisi and somebody from Leningrad might meet, or where a formerly dekulakized peasant might become very close with with a Communist Party member who very well may have collectivized one village over from them. In the end, the term by which soldiers could domesticate the front allowed the state to creep into their most intimate correspondences and their most intimate interactions and shape these conversations. And I'm going to actually leave it off there, just because I'm, again, much more interested to hear what you have to say than to talk on and on about this book that I spent a decade writing.
Well, thank you, Brendan.
I fielding or you fielding?
You.
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. I have a basic question. That is, who was doing the censoring? I'm wondering if that was a job for, say, women, or you know, who was directed into that labor. And also, I'm just curious to hear a little bit about your experience of working with the letters. You know, did you find what you expected to find? Was it made available to you easily? Just very basic question.
All right, so I'll start off with the first question. So they're constantly complaining about, particularly by the middle of the war, that the censors are not particularly competent and not particularly politically aware. Censors tend to be teenage girls. And that is for the reason that, not to put teenage girls down, but basically what happens is the most competent party people have all been mobilized into combat positions or leadership positions. And you know, this apparatus is largely made up of young women who are there to make sure that, who are basically, they're in that position so that men can be freed up for combat positions. And this is in the folklore of the military. Like when a soldier imagines a censor, he always imagines a woman. Several romances take place between rear area people and censors for this, in part because of this reason. And some of the things that they complain about, there's an inspection that they do in 1943, and they complain about things like, some of which are just basic lack of infrastructure things, where it's like, well, they're opening, some letters are actually with envelopes, like the vast majority are triangles, but some are with envelopes. They're opening the letters with chicken bones, and that's destroying them, or they're crossing things out in a way that either makes it obvious what has been crossed out, or make it potentially worse than what was actually there. There's a couple instances where letters to people like Lavrenti Beria, the head of the secret police, get censored. Obviously, he has a right to all information about everything in the Soviet Union. And then there's complaints about, you know, they not knowing who is in what position in the Soviet Union, or even some people who in 1943 think the Soviet Union is at war with Japan, which doesn't happen until, you know, August of 1945. So there's a big they have a big problem with this issue of political literacy. In terms of working with the letters themselves, so when I was working with letters, the main collections I was working with were just randomly in Kazan, just because I was taking Tatar language courses, and you know, basically any regional archive will have its collection of letters from the war. So I worked in Kazan, and I worked in the Komsomol archive in Moscow. And I basically just chose correspondences that were big. You know, if there were hundreds of letters, I'd go for that because you get a sense of who these people are, and you get a sense of, you know, it gives you a sense of character, and it's just much, narrative-wise, it's much more interesting, and content-wise, it's much more interesting. Which means that my letters almost certainly skewed towards more educated people, and certainly skewed towards people. It's the people who I follow closely are almost all officers in terms of the letter correspondences, and one Komsomol member she's a sergeant, but you know, and so. Some people, you read their letters, and it really is just like they just want to make sure their family knows that they're alive, and they don't have much to talk about. Some people, these letters are fascinating and filled with information that really gives you a sense of who they are. There's one published set of letters I read where the entire correspondence, there's nothing about war in it at all. It's all discussions of art. It's all this guy just discussing art and literature with his wife, pretending that the war is not going on. So you do find some surprising stuff. And oftentimes I get the question when I'm presenting on the letters section of this, particularly in Russia, so what actually is interesting in these letters? Which, I mean, to me, it's interesting what they're writing about just to see what this is as a genre and what function this fulfills. But you get some really surprising stuff, like the one guy who's basically he's got like 3 lines of letters, or 3 lines of text in this letter to his friend, and it's all profanity, and it's all either profanity or praising Stalin. Absolutely bizarre text to read, and just like very, very eye-opening in terms of, oh yeah, and if you were an Uzbek coming into the Red Army, how would you know that profanity is profanity? Because you're hearing the version of Russian that you're hearing, right? And in most militaries, this is a combination of profanity and various, you know, patriotic stamps. So, I hope that.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Can you say something about your research on the other physical objects? I mean, did you have access to a lot of them? Are they still available, like in secondhand stores, or is it all in museums now?
So before I was a historian, I was a collector. You know, way back when I was a student in St. Petersburg, going to various flea markets and picking up stuff. And spoons were something I very early on was like collecting as many spoons as possible, just because I was kind of I knew what these meant to soldiers, so I was just kind of fascinated by them. There was a version of this project that I thought I was going to do that was going to be a lot of going to museums and finding objects with provenances and trying to tell stories through these objects that you could identify. But as I got to the archives, I found that I could talk about these objects generically, I think in a way that I found much more interesting, where I could just look at the types of sources most people look at, you know, diaries and discussions in the political apparatus and so on and so forth, and they're talking about this stuff all the time. So it became much more about, you know, spoons as a thing rather than this guy's spoon. Although on occasion I do bring in this guy's spoon, this guy's rifle, so on and so forth. But you know, I mean, when I imagined what this was going to be when I was going to Russia to do the research, I was like, okay, I'm gonna spend a lot of time in these museums, and that never materialized. Russell.
I really hope to find out very soon, you know, when really the answer to my question, but you know, let me ask you first. So I'm wondering about, you know, how did you come up with the structure for the book and the units of analysis, and weren't you worried about the, you know, possibility of, you know, having too descriptive a project, and what kind of strategies and structures did you put in place to overcome this? And my second question is, you know, at what stage did the structure emerge? You know, whether is it you know, in the dissertation or later, and what were the other, you spoke about the version of your book that never got written, what were the possibilities of focusing the role in your writing process?
Sure. So let me see what order to do this in. So the structure emerged quite organically, just by kind of imagining what a soldier would have. And there are certain objects that basically migrated from chapter to chapter. So there's tobacco and tobacco paraphernalia ends up in 2 chapters, just because. The helmet kept migrating from the chapter about uniforms to the chapter about trenches, the chapter about uniforms, and ended up resting in the chapter about trenches because it's about protection. So by and large, I mean, the general structure, just since I didn't talk about it at the beginning, I might as well lay it out here. It starts off with the soldier's body and how the state takes control of and catalogs the soldier's body. It then dresses the soldier and looks at uniforms, both discussing uniforms ethnographically and also just the changing symbolism. And there's basically a sea change in terms of the symbolism the regime deploys, where there's a wholehearted embrace of old regime symbols that takes place in 1943 that would have been completely unimaginable from the perspective of, say, 1931. And that there's groundwork that's laid for that in the 30s, but it's still quite jarring when it happens. This includes the adoption of shoulder boards. So let me see. The shoulder boards that this guy's wearing right here, Bagonia, those were a hated symbol of the old regime that were torn off the shoulders of officers during the revolution. And then in 1943 they bring them back. And they bring them back explicitly to, one, underline discipline and mark that the Red Army is now a much more disciplined fighting force and that officers have greater authority, and 2, to mark themselves as the inheritors of all the military glory of the old regime. So directly adopting, a hated symbol of the old regime becomes something that makes total sense by the middle of the war, and that's a major part of that chapter. Another major part of that chapter is the way in which medals turn the soldier's uniform into a readable text for all involved. And then chapter 3 deals with rations and the moral economy of rationing and just the ethnography of what eating means, something I think I've shown some of today. Chapter 4, I presented most of chapter 4, or presented a big portion of chapter 4 today. This is shelter, right? What is the environment that these people live in? Chapter 5 is about labor and is about killing, it's about weapons. This, in terms of avoiding something that's too descriptive, this is the chapter where I come closest to failing to do that. There are sections of this chapter I'm still dissatisfied with because they're so descriptive. Because at some point I talk about weapons as tools, and there's this kind of like this 5 to 10 pages of like, these are what these different weapons do, and this is, these are tools for different things. This is the relationship you might have with them, so on and so forth. And then I do a less descriptive thing about how this recreates social stratification, how this, in many ways, is the Bolshevik concepts of labor and what labor should do, and labor practices taken to a new environment. So things that developed in the first 5-year plan deployed for the war, such as socialist competition and the merging of man and machine, so on and so forth. Chapter 6 became just kind of like miscellaneous stuff. And ironically, and strangely enough, it's a chapter I'm actually quite fond of because it does so many different things. This is the soldier's knapsack, this is knick-knacks, this is print propaganda, letters. And that was only written after I'd written the dissertation, because basically I got a postdoc and was like, I can either do a poor job of writing a first draft of this, or I can just finish this and then add this in when the book comes. And then chapter 7 was about trophies. And chapter 7, I initially thought was going to be an epilogue. I initially thought, okay, I'll write something very small about trophies, because we all know about this story about how the Red Army is sending parcels from the Third Reich at the very end of the war, and this is usually told as this story is usually told as this kind of bacchanalian at the end of the war. This is not something that needs to be thought about. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of contrast their material world with the material world that they're looting at the end of the war, with the world that they're interacting with at the end of the war. And that ended up being, I think, one of the potentially the most meaningful chapter in the book. And potentially the chapter that does the most work in terms of what I think will be changing the way that we look at the war. Because essentially I came to realize that this is not a mindless act of looting. This is a combination of Soviet jurisprudence, this is a combination of Marxist approaches to history, and traditional Russian ideas of what the Germans are. So essentially, I argue that this looting is the desire for vengeance, coming together with the fact that in the Soviet Union, felony convictions almost always are accompanied by the confiscation of property, with this idea that capitalism will lead to, that basically Nazism is the end form of capitalism. It is the end form of greed that will make you kill your neighbors and take their stuff. and that the Germans have always been the most bourgeois nation. If you look at 19th century Russian literature, right, that these things come together to make this make a lot of sense. So yeah, and so yeah. I mean, I think, did I more or less answer your questions?
Hi, truly fascinating, and I'm looking forward to reading the whole book. I was wondering about the categories as well, as Robson was, and the second and the third are very, part 2 and part 3 are very straightforward. And the first one has a very intriguing title, Mortal Envelopes. And you talked quite a bit about the letters, but less about the body itself. And so I was wondering if you can talk about that metaphor that you used there. And also, I find that when working in archives, there are always these little pockets of the archive, or sometimes a bigger pocket than what's actually been processed, that has not been processed. And sometimes it has to do with kind of the limit of the archive. They don't know how to process visual material, or there are just objects that stick out and they don't quite know what to deal with them. So I was wondering if you found objects like that in your work that kind of test, archival limits and practices, and especially maybe in the thing bag, were there any material remains that you were working with, or with the trophies?
So I'll start with the second question. So in terms of in the archives themselves, and these are not things that were unprocessed, but these were things that were quite interesting. Some of the most interesting things I came across were various drawings and even models for things that they were thinking of adopting but then didn't. So I'll give you 2 examples. Lots of soldiers wrote in with requests for new medals that the state should come up with, some of which were clearly adopted. There's a couple things that I think are pretty clearly, somebody wrote in, Stalin saw it and said, this is a good idea, let's do this. Like the wound stripes, that seems to have been something that a soldier came up with and was adopted. But lots of people wrote in for different types of medals, and even did drawings of what these medals should look like, that did not get adopted. Another thing that came up that was really fascinating, and this is going to be a prolonged aside, so please forgive me, but in the Red Army, there were, in the course of the war, 2 major forms of identification. There were these little Bakelite capsules that had newsprint inside that were supposed to be taken from a soldier who was killed, and there was 2 copies filled out, all their information, their next of kin, so on and so forth. One copy was supposed to be taken by the commander, the other copy was supposed to stay with the body so it could be identified. Lots of soldiers threw these away. Lots of peasant soldiers threw these away because they called them death passports, because they were certain that if they filled them out, they were sealing their fate. So the state, and this was also only really useful for identifying dead people. So in September of 1941, they realized that they don't have an army-wide form of identification for living people. So they come up with this Red Army booklet, which is also newsprint, which is supposed to be with the soldier at all times, which also has all sorts of information about how to use this soldier and about how they've served, medals, uniforms, all this other stuff, weapons, they've been issued, all this other stuff. So they get rid of the death capsule when they adopt this. But they also understand that this is newsprint. And while it's supposed to be taken from the body when someone is killed, if it's not, it's going to disintegrate. And in general, it's going to disintegrate. So there's this. I saw this really fascinating thing they were planning on doing, but there's a huge rubber shortage. So it was a piece of rubber cloth that the person would write all their information on, and then it would be sewn shut and kept in the soldier's pocket. And I saw actually several. They had several copies of this that they were thinking of adopting in 1942, and then they just didn't do it for various reasons. So the stuff that didn't get made, I've seen some of that. In terms of unprocessed stuff, one of the archives I was working at, they were very generous and let me work with stuff that they were still in the process of cataloging, and there were some really interesting things in there as well, like just short propaganda pieces that were produced at the front during the war. That were not edited because a political worker was writing them, so it was basically assumed that they had editorial authority and were not going to write something that needed to be censored. So stuff like that I got to see. So your question about the first section of the book and whether or not it makes, what is the organizing logic there?
No, I'm not questioning that. I was just really intrigued. I loved your title, The Mortal Envelopes, and I was wondering if you make a connection between the bodies and the letters, whether it's a connection that, you know, to me, that title makes that connection. I was wondering.
Well, the irony here, of course, is, right, the vast majority of letters have no envelopes. So what I'm actually trying to channel with that title, Mortal Envelopes, is the way in which clothing becomes a second skin, because they're often not changing their clothing for months at a time, and talking about the way in which, you know, they have these weird tan lines, talking about the way in which they really feel like their uniform has become part of their skin. So it's all about the processes that keep a person alive, as well as this outer layer of their new sense of self that comes with the uniforms. So that's how that ended up in that. And that's why those 3 chapters ended up with that particular title. Nick.
Great project, very interesting talk, and congratulations on the book. So, if I understand you correctly, what you're doing essentially is, you're not acting like a traditional kind of archaeologist and looking at material objects and trying to deduce things from the objects themselves. You're principally relying on what the people are saying about the objects. And as you said, you're sort of tending to look at the same things that other people look at, like diaries, letters, and so forth, but focusing on what they say about objects as a way to sort of tell a social history of the Red Army. So my question is, why? In other words, is there an advantage, to doing that? Instead of just looking at the letters and seeing what they say about whatever you're interested in, what's the advantage of focusing on that part of it where they're essentially talking about material objects? And is there some, special insight that comes as a result of that? And then, relatedly, is this things that other people do with other militaries, other armies, other wars? And the thing that jumped out at me, which is actually, I'm sure it's different, but it's that book, the author is, but it's the things that carry.
Kim O'Brien.
Yeah. Is it a kind of a thing to do this about warfare? But anyway, so the basic question is, what's the purchase in focusing on what people say about the material objects?
Well, I'll give you a bad reason and a good reason why I did not take an archaeological approach.
No, I meant more like why narrow yourself to material objects.
Well,
I can get for sure why you don't want to just focus.
As I was reading these letters, I was not only looking at the material object stuff. I was also cataloging these letters for future projects and just trying to get a sense of what they say, who these people are, what other things I can learn about the war. If you remember, way back when I started at Berkeley, I was going to be working on national minorities in the Red Army. And some of these, and one of the things that happened as I was doing this project on national minorities is I started looking at letters and propaganda, is the extent to which they're just talking about stuff all the time. And one of the things to keep in mind is that, remember, this is the Soviet Union. It is a socialist dictatorship that promises greater abundance, that functionally is constantly in a state of shortage, and that is basically distributing stuff to key demographics, while often taking stuff away from other key demographics who it views as outside of its political body. Objects have a certain weight and importance in the Soviet system that I would argue they would not necessarily have in other systems. Another thing to keep in mind with all of this as well, and this is unrelated but I think is worth mentioning, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union to take shit from the Soviet Union, right? They were there to take food and everything possible from Soviet people, right? This is a war that is explicitly being fought for things for the benefit of German citizens in the Third Reich, right? I mean, there's been very interesting, very good work on this. Stuff is really important to this war in a way that Red Army soldiers are going to be thinking and writing about stuff in a way that U.S. Army soldiers are not, because U.S. Army soldiers are coming from a state of abundance, right? And they're coming from a consumer society. And it's easy to replace things in the U.S. Army in a way that is not in the Red Army, right? So there's a certain salience that's just there that I just picked up on without, before I was even doing this project, that kind of led me to want to think more about material culture and objects. And in terms of have other people done stuff like this? Well, in terms of a direct material culture approach and war, I can't think of anybody. There are lots of people who've done material culture stuff, particularly on late socialism or on really early socialism. There's very rich work on that. But for whatever reason, during the war itself, there's not a lot of work that's been done on this. And I can't think of, there are collector's guides. There are collector's guides for every army, everywhere, fetishizing this stuff. Like, you can find that all you want. Very few of them are going to offer any interpretation of what this stuff meant. So, that's kind of what I'm trying to do is one of, and in terms of Tim O'Brien, in part this project emerged from Yuri and I having brunch one day and him being like, "You read Tim O'Brien? You want to do that with the Red Army?" Like, yeah, that sounds great. So, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Very interesting. Two questions. One, as you mentioned, that there was great mixing within the army between different ethnicities, men and women. But I wanted to see if you could maybe parse that a little bit and talk about whether you observed any differences, in the correspondence and the letters, and also in the objects, that may have been of particular significance to the different demographic groups. And then the second question is, you described the Red Army experience as sort of a total institution that where the state imprints itself on the soldiers in multiple ways. And I was wondering if you could talk, but also, the sort of the agency aspect of it. If you could talk about, any kind of subversive acts within the army or ways of kind of pushing back against being, another sort of a body for killing within the army. Thank you.
Great, those are great questions. Thanks. So in terms of mixing in the army and different objects that might have salience to different groups of people. So there's this weird thing where the Red Army abandons territorial principle of recruitment before the war, but then during the war there are units that are raised, like there's a what ends up becoming the 8th Guards Rifle Division is basically raised in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and has like a very large number of Kazakhs and Kyrgyz. So there are units that end up being for small periods of the war, or some of them end up establishing relationships with the home republics and get more soldiers from those areas. There are units that end up being ethnically more of one group or stably one group than other units. So that is a thing that happens. But by and large, there would be groups of people who would be sent to the front to fill units that had suffered heavy casualties. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll find out, okay, guys, I just heard we're going to get a bunch of Uzbeks. So here's what we're going to do. There's that dead horse over there. We've got some rice. We've got some carrots. We're going to make them plov so that they feel at home. Or they find out there's going to be a bunch of people from Central Asia. They make tea houses for them because all that requires is a little bit of labor. So, and they make a point that they actually are discussing at high levels of the Communist Party. So, if you have guys from Central Asia, they probably don't drink, but they drink tea. If one of them gets a medal, they all want to get together and have tea. So let's build some tea houses if we know that there's a lot of people from Central Asia. They're also producing print propaganda in all of the languages of the Soviet Union. They're supposed to be distributed to units based on the number of people of that ethnicity in that unit. But this is something that's constantly in flux and seems to constantly be behind. And then you also have the problem of you have bureaucrats who can't tell the difference between Armenian and Georgian, so they're sending Armenians Georgian language newspapers. Big problem. But in terms of more personal, lots of people are carrying religious objects. So the types of religious objects are obviously going to vary depending on what your religion is. but lots of people are carrying crosses or prayer beads or obreki, which are basically prayers wrapped in leather or wood. Lots of people are carrying those. Women have all sorts of problems with the material culture of the army because the Red Army does not imagine a woman's body. So they're not providing women with underwear, bras, anything for menstruation. And this ends up being an issue that's brought up that's often brought up by the Komsomol organization, where they're like, oh, we need to start issuing women more first aid packs because they have this thing that happens to them once a month. And the Army is not like imagining that until they actually face with it, until they have women coming to them and complaining to them through the party, which is quite interesting. In terms of the Red Army as a total institution, so it tries really hard to be a total institution. But it is an army fighting a war that for the first 2 years of the war it's basically losing. It is an army that cannot always project the strength that it wants to project, and it's an army that's working with cadres that it's often not satisfied with how educated or how politically conscious they are. So there are all sorts of forms of subversion that happen, from very commonly soldiers not knowing the password when they're on guard duty, or just talking to civilians casually when they're supposed to be doing, military stuff, to very unclear lines as to what kind of relationship should exist between commanders and their female subordinates. Something that's negotiated, something I've written about elsewhere, but that is being constantly negotiated, essentially. To various things. So like in the Red Army, if you shoot yourself in the hand, that's a capital offense. So what soldiers start doing is they start doing what's called voting, which is around dawn, you hold your hand over the trench. So that means that the enemy has shot you, and how are you going to prove that? Well, eventually the Army starts collecting statistics on who has been hit in the left hand, and they're sending these statistics up because most people want to get hit in the left hand. Most people are right-handed. These are peasants. They want to work, right? So you put your left hand up. So anybody who gets shot in the left hand becomes suspect. In 1941, 1942, desertion is a huge problem, right? As the Army is retreating, units collapse, and some people just go home. And in 1943, there's several accounts of they come back to a village. It's filled with people deserted from the Red Army, and basically they just take these guys in because they need people. And some people really complaining about this, that there needs to be greater filtration. Some of these people serve the Germans, so on and so forth. So there are abundant opportunities to subvert this attempt at a total institution, on the one hand. On the other hand, this is an institution that is very comfortable being very violent to get what it needs to get done. I'll suffice to say, and I can go into more detail of this if you want later, the Red Army executes orders of magnitude higher number of its own soldiers than any other army in World War II. So does that, do you want to follow up, or is that?
No, that's good, thank you.
Yes.
So you mentioned a lot about kind of bringing people together and different cultures all kind of being within the same area and working together. But did you come across any cases of anti-Semitism or racism within all of these different groups? Because obviously they are different ethnicities, and that meshing is not always a smooth process.
Yeah. So of course the official army policy is that everyone is together. Russians may be first among equal, and mastery of Russian is important to being a soldier. But in practice, what you find is, well, one thing that happens that's a huge issue is, so the Russian language becomes a subject that must be taught in all schools only in 1938, which means that large numbers of men from non-Russian areas who are being drafted in the Red Army have no Russian language skills, or very limited Russian language skills, which means that, and they're being drafted at exactly the point when things are at their worst, when the Army is really, really in danger. So you do come across, in the spring of 1942 in particular, lots of very racist stuff about people from various republics of the Soviet Union, where even some commanders are like, I can't wait till all these guys get killed because then maybe they'll send us some Russians. And the army responds to this, and this is something I've written about elsewhere as well, and something that I do talk about in the book a little bit. The army responds to this by creating a separate political apparatus, like basically a subsidiary political apparatus to serve non-Russian soldiers, where they're basically identifying people who can speak both Russian and whatever the native language of these soldiers is and translate for them and teach them stuff, where Russian language education becomes really, really important in non-Russian regions for men 15 years and older, so that they have basic command of the language. Propaganda that is aimed at these people, and propaganda about what people from various ethnic groups are doing for the war effort. These are all things that you run into. And it seems that by 1943, basically this is kind of more or less worked out to where either they're keeping these guys in the rear long enough to train them well enough that they have enough command of Russian that they're not doing things that are, they're not getting themselves killed very quickly and not endangering their comrades. And that there seems to have been overall in the army a sense that yes, we're all in this together, people start making friends, so on and so forth. That being said, you can find till the very end of the war on a local level, you'll find units where there's one memoirist who I work with, who is himself a Jew, talks about, in our unit we got along well with Kazakhs, but we didn't like Armenians. So sometimes it's like local racism that is based on, whatever, it might be based on just like there was one Armenian guy who didn't do so well, and now they're assuming all Armenian guys are like this. So you do run into that. Anti-Semitism is definitely something you run into, and again, it's localized. It's all with issues of racism and anti-Semitism. It seems to be very, very much about who this community of people are, where they're drawn from, what their experiences are. In some memoirs and some non-Russians who I read about, there's no issues. Others, others like there's one fairly famous collection of letters and diary and a diary by a Jewish officer where his whole experience is basically being treated poorly because he's a Jew, and his authority constantly being undermined by the fact that he's surrounded by anti-Semites. So it varied dramatically based on just who you happen to be with. And same thing with women, right? You could be under constant threat of sexual harassment, or you could be treated with respect and dignity, and it all depended on who your commander was, who your comrades were, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Sure.
I'm interested in the participation and role and experience of prisoners. Where do you come across letters from them, and also were they dispersed throughout, the troops, or were there separate troops made up of prisoners?
So, because I'm dealing with people who are in the army, as soon as somebody becomes a prisoner, I stop paying attention to them, just because of the scope of this project, unless they come back into the army, right? And then once they come back into the army, I'm interested in them again. So, let's say that you're taken prisoner in 1941 or 1942, and you're liberated, 6 months later. What would happen to you? And 41, almost no chance you would have survived, actually. So let's say 1942, and then you come back, you're liberated in 43 and sent back in the army. You'd go through a filtration camp, and these filtration camps were run by the NKVD, the secret police, and they were basically like if you were going to get typhus, if you were going to be in one of these filtration camps, because these are low priority people who have been put together so that they can be interrogated and figured out what, did this guy work for the Germans? Is this person a war criminal? Is this person just unlucky? So on and so forth. However, by and large, from pretty much, and for many people this is deeply insulting, because it's also, many people who are partisans also go through these filtration camps. So people who were not prisoners, but who just happen to be on enemy territory for an extended period of time. And they're deeply insulted by the fact that these guys were like, I fought in the front line, and a bunch of people who have never been towards the front are now making decisions about what's going to happen to me. However, the vast majority of people who go through filtration go back into the army. And even though there is this rhetoric about anyone who allows himself to be taken alive is a traitor, can never be part of the Soviet community, their family will forsake them, blah, 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 even though that is rhetorically the case, from December of 1941 on, they understand that they need people, and that they're going to need to basically have massive turnover, and they really are going to have to figure out, okay, this guy was a politsai, all right, then he either goes to the camp or we execute him. This guy was unlucky, fine. They can go back in the army. Now that would follow them bureaucratically, right? That would be in their personal file, liczne dzieło. That would constantly be there, right? And that would potentially even be in the Red Army booklet, depending on how faithfully they filled it out, right? So that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But the need for soldiers made it such that they constantly are integrating people who are prisoners of war.
Right.
Okay.
So part of your premise and part of what you're describing is how the army is a total institution, in a sense that it's almost microcosmic, right? Would that be a term that you would use?
It is, but it's also in many ways and in many situations, the line between the civilian world and the army blurs dramatically. So if you're a Red Army soldier, you will almost definitely be doing agricultural work at some point, right? Because what often happens is the Red Army comes and liberates a place, there's actually no government there to run it. So they'll take over a kolkhoz, and they'll be giving part of that to the local civilians, part of that to themselves. Or they'll be running their own farms, right? So in some ways, then they're no longer a microcosm, then they're just integrated more into, then they're also integrated into the wider society.
I mean, in the sense that they see it as microcosmic, right? In the sense that it really does spill over into society as a whole.
Oh, okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But you could also make a case that, as you do, that this is not exceptional. That's what a modern army is,
Mhm.
a conscript army. I mean, you're taken, you're reshaped,
Mhm.
destroyed is one thing, rebuilt is something else.
Mhm.
Your entire material life, as you're showing us, there's very few traces left from home. It's an entirely new outfitting. So I think it's very, very, very. I mean, I like the approach and I like the thesis, which is that this is the Soviet army, but you can see it in other armies as
Mhm.
well. If you were to talk about what the differences might be, how would you begin to talk about that? How this is somehow unique or different or departs from experiences in modern armies?
Sure. Yeah, this is something I think about quite a bit, and as you know, my second project is premised on trying to figure that out. So one of the things that's unique to the Red Army, and this isn't a material culture issue, this is just a thing that's unique to the Red Army, the willingness to use violence against its own soldiers is much greater than in any other military that I know. Even the group that comes the closest after them are the Nazis, and they're still killing many, many less of their own soldiers. One of the other things, but in terms of material culture stuff, the Red Army's experience is determined by shortage in a way that probably the Finnish army, probably some of the other smaller countries that are allied with the Third Reich are determined by. But in terms of the major players in the war, the Red Army's experience is determined by shortage. It's this fascinating mix. This is one of the things that brought me to this project, of absolutely archaic stuff, like the thing bag. That's something you could see on the backs of rural wanderers in the 19th century, right? Like the peredvižniki, if you look at peredvižniki paintings, you see thing bags. The partianki, which are these basically rectangles of cloth that you wrap around your foot instead of wearing socks, which were on the feet of medieval peasants that are being used in the Red Army. The tunics that they're wearing, much of their clothing is this militarized peasant gear. That archaic, that humble, that very crude stuff that they're using for clothing, for shelter, all that stuff, alongside some of the most advanced technology of the war, right? They have arguably the best tank, they have arguably the best submachine gun, blah, 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 right? I mean, they have some really, really advanced technology that they're using. And that hybrid regime, where it is, we're an army of peasants and we're fine with using peasant stuff, but we're going to be, those peasants will be using really, really advanced, but also oftentimes very, very easy to make, relatively crudely manufactured stuff. That's unique to the Red Army, I think, right? I mean, if you look at the U.S. Army, it's like there's a bunch of people in what were essentially sports clothing of that time, using weapons that were designed like, you know, basically weapons that were designed in kind of Fordist principles of like maximum bang for buck, not the best thing that you can make, but the best thing that you can make cheaply and in large numbers. So, you know, I mean, in that regard, I would say that's part of what makes, and the Red Army is also obsessed with symbolism in a way that only the Third Reich is equally obsessed with. Like the Red Army, they're obsessed with medals. Soldiers wear their medals at all times. In the German Army, they're obsessed with medals. Soldiers wear some of their medals, depending on, there's certain medals you wear all the time. And the Red Army is actually copying certain German, they're like researching what the Germans are doing and in some ways emulating what they're doing with decorations. Does that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Did you come across any accounts of other soldiers from other countries, their reactions to the Red Army's material life or material conditions? I just am trying to think about what it would be like for an American soldier to see somebody with a thing bag and foot wraps.
Yeah. Everyone commented. What I find more of is civilians. There's one Polish woman who writes this fascinating account of the Red Army coming in December of 1944, January 1945. She's living near Budapest. Her husband's Hungarian, and she's like, they're so dirty. Their uniforms are so plain looking. They're like, she's totally aghast at that. But they all have so many medals. And she has this thing where it's like everyone has at least 3 medals, and then like the commanders all have like at least 2 rows of medals on each side of their chest, and it's like and so like there are reactions that I was Gabor Rittersporn was telling me about. This is about Japan. When the Red Army came to Manchuria, someone he knew was like a small child, and that they looked like bums, but that their singing was incredible. Was this person's account impression from all this?
Thank you.
I'm sure there are many hypotheses and many reasons, but could you tell us why the Red Army killed more of its soldiers than any other army? You've said it a couple of times, and I just wondered about the research on that.
I think there's a couple things going on here. I mean, one, I think
Can you just say the numbers again? I think you say them before, but they're so extraordinary.
If you were to count the number of people who are listed as prosecuted in permanent losses for the Red Army, it's around 900,000. Half of those were commuted to serve in penal battalions, and then a significant portion of those people were sent to prison. The best estimate that I've heard for number of Red Army soldiers executed by the Soviet Union is 135,000. That's 10 divisions. The division being the basic, military unit that functioned in World War II. By way of contrast, the Third Reich, the best estimates are 15 to 30,000, largely because they're killing a lot of them at the end of the war when things are falling apart, so they're estimated. The U.S. kills 142 people. One of them for desertion / cowardice, and this person has a film made about them, there's a book written about them, Martin Sheen plays them in the movie, Eddie Slovik, and the vast majority for rape and murder. So, just to get a sense of how much more dramatic. One thing is, remember that the Red Army does this almost immediately, right? In 1918, decimation after the fall of Kazan is something that they engage in. They are willing to use violence in a way that a lot of other regimes are not willing to use violence. The Germans, towards the end of the war, look a lot like the Red Army in terms of how violent they're being towards their own people, and they're also doing something the Red Army didn't do, which is when they kill someone, often leaving their body on display as to terrify other people. The Red Army doesn't do that. The Red Army executes people in front of soldiers and does this in a ritualized way, and almost everyone talks about either early in their service or at various points in their service, seeing the state demonstrate that it has the right to take people's lives away. Right? That happens. But I think they're doing this for several reasons. One reason is simply that this is a regime that's on the verge of collapse, and in the absence of other forms of motivation, and also in the presence of other forms of motivation, but in this incredibly desperate situation, they are more willing to take lives, they're more willing to appeal to violence than they would be at other times, and then most other regimes would be that are not in that desperate situation. I think that's key. Another thing is strictly if you look at the way that a military tribunal works, they don't have a lot of wiggle room. The option, it's a lot like a troika during the terror. The options are basically totally innocent, penal battalion once they set up the penal battalions, or kill, right? Those are the options. And again, with this Pauschalne sistema, right, with this system where you're going to be rewarded for fulfilling these, where you're basically going to be rewarded for prosecution and under question for not prosecuting. This leads to, you know, there are strong reasons why if you're a prosecutor in the Red Army, you're probably going to not go for leniency, or leniency is going to be sending someone to a penal battalion rather than executing them. So I think those are the main reasons, and the fact that they want to use them to show people that the state has this power, right? Because there's very few accounts I can think of where somebody does not mention having seen someone executed.
Well, Brendan, thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.